Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Hello. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on Mahsa Amini and the morality police in Iran. So we're going to start off with a few questions, but first let me introduce our panelists. We have Dr. Yagubi, an Iranian American. Her research concerns the literature of the Middle East with a special focus on Persian and Armenian literature. She has published work on the members of sexual, ethnic, and religious minoritized groups, ones more marginalized by normative society. She addresses the embodiments of liminality through which authors and directors challenge and critique social hegemonies through different topics, including but not limited to temporary marriage in Iran and how members of ethno-religious and cultural minoritized populations of Iran and later in the US negotiate their identity through their creativity. We also have Dr. Nader Hashemi. He's the director of the Center for Middle East Studies and an associate professor of Middle East and Islamic politics at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver. His research and intellectual research interests lie at the intersection of comparative politics and political theory, in particular debates on religion and democracy, secularism, and its discontents, the Middle East and Islamic politics, democratic and human rights struggles in non-Western societies, and Islam-West relations. He's the author of Islam, Secularism, and Liberal Democracy Toward a Democratic Theory for Muslim Societies, and a lot of other works. He is also a non-resident fellow at the Democracy for the Arab World Now. And then lastly, we have MPAC's very own president, Dr. Salam El-Mayati. So on September 16th, Mahsa Amini, also known as Zhina, was a 22-year-old Kurdish woman who died under contentious circumstances in a detention center in Iran after her arrest by the morality police, who accused her of violating the laws on compulsory veiling. In the wake of her death, thousands of Iranians have taken to the streets to protest against the theocratic and authoritarian nature of the current Iranian political system. So we'll have our panelists here to discuss the complexity surrounding this topic. And we have a lot of questions, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Our first question, I'm going to read the first two questions, and I know Dr. Yagubi had a video that she wanted to touch on first, so I'll go ahead and read that. So one, what is the history behind enforcing the hijab in Iran? And did other laws exist prior to the 1979 revolution that also politicized the Iranian women's choice to wear the hijab? And then also, what is the history behind the morality police in Iran, and when did it come to exist? Thank you.
Did you want me to go first?
Yeah, you can go ahead and share your screen first, and then everyone else can go after.
So first of all, hi, everyone. Thank you, MPAC, for organizing and raising awareness about this important moment in history of modern Iran. And thank you for the invitation, Lobna. I'm happy to be here, and I will share my PowerPoint. I want to take everyone on a very quick but centuries of basically history of modern Iran in terms of, women's rights and the importance of what happened?
I think if you click slideshow at the top, you can go ahead and play from start. Yeah.
Okay, the history of hijab and women's movement. So I want to take you back to 1850s and to this important figure in history of modern Iran, Tahir Qurratul Ain, a Babi Baha'i religious figure who resisted and unveiled publicly at the time and was therefore executed. So at the time, she was wearing the veil. And this is important because, I want to emphasize that even during the Qajar era, which was in 19th century, we did have the royal family, for example, in the and the elites of the society who were wearing the hijab as a class status marker. And then at this time, we had the workers, working class families who were working in the farms not wearing the hijab actually because of, practicality reasons. So while the recent protests against this compulsory veiling in Iran today mark a very crucial historic moment in women's rights movement and resistance, we have to recognize that women have struggled in Iran for the right to veil or unveil for almost 170 years already. And as I mentioned, we had the examples from 19th century, 1850s, 1880s, and then we come to the Pahlavi era, right before the Islamic Revolution with Reza Shah, that we have the police enforced unveiling and westernization and modernization agenda of the country in 1936. And as you can see in this image, the Western type of dress code that even men were supposed to conform to. And then we come to 1960s and 1970s, and despite all the, ideological differences that all different political groups had, they had one agenda, one common agenda, and that was anti-imperialism and anti-Shah demonstrations. And therefore, at this time period, women started wearing the hijab during their demonstrations to make a statement, to protest against that kind of, secularism and westernization in Iran. And then right after the revolution in 1979, March 6th of 1979, March 7, 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini declared the compulsory veiling decree, and women took to the streets spontaneously against this decree, and they demonstrated on March 8, 1979. And here are some images from those demonstrations. So at this point, they were not wearing their veils necessarily. So as you can see how with different institutions, the veil has been politicized in Iran up to this point. And then even though, at the time, Ayatollah Khomeini did not, mandate the hijab, but by 1983, it was mandated and women had to wear the hijab in workplaces, in, universities and in the public sphere. So what this did was isolating certain groups of women, the more, secular women, and then at the same time, on the other hand, encouraging conservative women to engage in public arena. And this was also in 1980s when we are in, engaging, we are in the middle of the Iran-Iraq war, and then the Basij militia, is born at this time. And at the same time, in around 1983, we also have the birth of morality police or morality guard, however we call it, Pasdaran, and different. They came with different names. In 1980s, we see this propaganda with hijab all over the country. This is the time period that I was a child in the country. During my childhood, so we would see these posters either on the walls or on the newspapers, magazines, which were comparing the improperly veiled women to properly veiled ones. And this was part of the, the purification program agenda of Ayatollah Khomeini to basically cleanse the country or purify the country of all corruptions or corrupt manifestations of the monarchical regime and the West. So again, it was a continuation of the same anti-Shah, anti-imperialism. And these are some images of the time. This is referencing the influence of bad friends. If you have a friend who is improperly veiling, so that will influence you. And this one, which is also dominant discourse in the West, as you all know, it is about, if you are not properly veiled or if you're not wearing the proper dress code, then you're attracting sexual harassment. This all, everything that was going on, of course, increasingly contributed to the politicization of sexuality, gender, and specifically like citizens' bodies and the female body in the country. And in 1990s and 1990s and 2000s, the young generation that was basically the children of the revolution, they were called children of the revolution, and they were the targeted audience of the Islamization project and agenda of Ayatollah Khomeini and the Islamic Republic, were starting to find new ways of expressing their sexuality, expressing their desires and needs. And one of them was the new trends and fashion trends of veiling that we see also in this image. And there were many individualized resistances against compulsory veiling at this time period. However, there were also, campaigns and mobilized collective movements, not necessarily just against the compulsory veiling, but against this gender apartheid and gender segregation and discriminatory laws in, for example, family protection law, marriage, custody, age of marriage. So we had the Stop Stoning Forever campaign and the 1 million signatures campaign at the time. These are in 2006. And then 2009, everyone knows that we went through that rigged election for the second term that Ahmadinejad became the president. And I want to emphasize that at this time, we do see women at the forefront of the campaign and the movements, demonstrations, as you see in these images. Moving forward, 2010, 2013, 15, 17, we see various campaigns against compulsory veiling. So just to name a few of them, No to Compulsory Hijab in 2013, Will Vote Unveiled in 2015, My Stealthy Freedom in 2015, and the White Wednesdays in 2017. And this is the time when we have access to internet and the digital media, cyberspace, and the hashtags and everything. So those were very instrumental for these campaigns. And then on December 27, 2017, this girl that you see in the image, Vida Movahed, climbed onto this utility box on Engelab Street, one of the most crowded streets in Tehran, and put her white headscarf on a stick and waved it to the crowd, transforming hijab, which has been a form of political oppressive tool in Iran, into a peaceful protest or flag as a symbol of peaceful protest. She was immediately, arrested, imprisoned, but then she got out later on bail, obviously. And the Girls of Revolution Street hashtag went viral. Everyone on social media started, using it and changing their images to unveiled pictures. And men also supported women in solidarity, started wearing the veil instead of their wives or their partners or their sisters wearing the veil. A lot of women and men together on the streets inside the country also joined and did some campaigning, but many were arrested, basically. Very recently, November 5th, 2021, just last year, we had this very interesting theatrical and ideological kind of war against each other between students in Tehran University, one of the most important universities in Tehran. At the entrance, a group of students, the upper picture, the students at the time of their graduation, these are the students who are against compulsory veiling. They took off their veil and they used some red scarves on their shoulders. In response to that, the next day, the students who are more pro-regime and pro-compulsory veiling staged another, another campaign or another form of protest to what the other group had done the next day, wearing red scarves and completely veiled in their chadors and also wearing red masks. Then we come to this moment with, Mahsa Amini, whose images went viral on social media a few days after, she was arrested. And then we saw the images of her on the hospital bed. And she was arrested for allegedly being improperly veiled. And this is an image which also went viral because the Niloufar Hamedi, the journalist who is right now in solitary confinement, took this image of Zhina's parents at the hospital. And then Zhina's parents made a conscious decision to do a public funeral, which incited, the entire fury and anger amongst the nation, beginning with that Kurdish city, Saqqez, where Zhina was living and was born. And then we saw images such as this of the protest going on. And then this became the anthem of Shervin Hajipur's, music, which became the anthem for this protest going on, because everyone started on social media, especially on Twitter, tweeting about why they are protesting, and they started writing sentences for this, for that. And so the music is a compilation of all those tweets, and Shervin is singing it. So it's called For Freedom. If I can play that for everyone for a minute, it's very short. Can I play it?
Yeah, I think so. Are you able to?
Okay, maybe, I don't know. Okay.
برای توی کوچه رقصیدن، برای ترسیدن به وقت بوسیدن، برای خواهرم، خواهرت، خواهرامون، برای تغییر مغزها که پوسیدن، برای شرمندگی، برای بیپولی، برای حسرت یک زندگی معمولی، برای کودک زباله‌گرد و آرزوهاش، برای این اقتصاد دستوری، برای این هوای آلوده، برای ولیعصر و درختای فرسوده، برای پیروز و احتمال انقراضش، برای سگهای بیگناه ممنوعه، برای گریه های بیوقفه، برای تصویر تکرار این لحظه، برای چهره ای که میخنده، برای دانش آموزا، برای آینده، برای این بهشت اجباری، برای نخبه های زندانی، برای کودکان افغانی، برای این همه، برای غیر تکراری، برای این همه شعارهای تو خالی، برای آوار خونه های پوشالی، برای احساس آرامش، برای خورشید پس از شبای طولانی، برای روزهای حساب و بیخوابی، برای مرد میهن آبادی، برای دختری که آرزو داشت پسر بود، برای زن زندگی آزادی، برای آزادی، برای آزادی، برای آزادی.
So what I try to basically show in this very quick, image visual journey is that, how successive governments in Iran, regimes in Iran have tried to politicize veiling, using veiling, politicized female bodies, and that, it at this point in the context of Iran's history, veiling is not as much about religion as it is about patriarchal, heteronormative patriarchal institutions, power relations, subordination of bodies, citizens' bodies. There is also questions of consumerism. There is objectification of sexuality. There is also, commodification of female body. And also like neoliberal, institutions, because with this fashion industry, with different, the variety of fashion trends with veiling, there is obviously so much about, consumerism and capitalism. Thank you. Sorry if I talk too much.
No, thank you. I know that was a lot to put into a small amount of time, so thank you. Dr. Hashmi, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, that was a good overview. I think the key theme here to understand what's happening in Iran today and what some of the core ethical issues at stake in the protests in Iran, specifically with respect to the status of women, is the relationship between authoritarianism and veiling. So Claudia rightly sort of pointed out that there is a backstory to this. In 1936, the then, king of Iran, Reza Shah, had a very similar project to the Islamic revolutionaries that came to power in 1979. It was only ideologically very different. It was basically using women's bodies as a platform to pursue an ideological project to create the model citizen that would then lead the nation forward toward, prosperity. In many ways, one can actually make a direct link between that process of authoritarian control over women's bodies and the horror and revulsion that it invoked in a very traditional society, with what happened in 1979, where again revolutionaries come to power using women's bodies to construct an ideal model citizen, and without allowing for dissenting point of views. And so this is sort of a longer story, a historical problem in Iran. One of the good things that's happening today on the streets of Iran is that the core demand is not for the complete rejection of the hijab, but for having it optional, for having giving women the right to choose what they want to wear. But of course, in the process of the last 43 years of the Islamic Republic of Iran, there has been so many injustices and so much bloodshed and so many political prisoners and abuse of citizens' rights, particularly women's rights, that one of the facts about contemporary Iranian society is that as a result of authoritarian religion being imposed on society without allowing for dissenting point of views, you have a situation where there is broad and widespread societal secularization in Iran. People just, unfortunately, I would argue from a Muslim perspective, but completely understandable, people reaching the conclusion that Islam writ large here is the problem, and that their experience, the citizens of Iran's experience with Islam now suggests that religion only manifests itself in very toxic and authoritarian ways, and we don't want anything to do with it. And that's a result of authoritarian versions of political Islam when you impose them on a citizenry who gradually has different views then you produce this type of backlash. It's in many ways, it's the reverse of actually what happened prior to the revolution, where state-imposed secularization produces an Islamic or religious uprising and response. But the key theme here is the continuity of authoritarianism. And the big hope is that moving forward, if Iran can make a democratic transition in the coming months and years, there will be a new form of political system that allows people, particularly women, to choose how they want to wear, what they want to wear, and how they want to behave in public without having an authoritarian leader or a class of ruling elites telling them what to do. So that's one of the big, I think, takeaways, one of the big lessons here, because this is MPAC program. There's probably a lot of Muslims watching this particular program that aren't following the intricacies of Iranian politics. But I think one of the big takeaways here for American Muslims, for other Muslims who are thinking about the relationship between religion and politics, is to see the predictable consequences of authoritarian politics that uses and abuses religion to keep a political system in power, producing as a result precisely the type of protest that we're seeing in Iran today, and a wide-scale sort of rejection of forced veiling and also any manifestation of political Islam. There's parallels to what's happening in Iran today into Turkey because of the policies of Erdogan and his sort of Islamization program or Islamist policies. But of course, these countries are very different, but there has been a similar societal backlash and questioning about political Islam in Turkey as well. The case of Iran is, I think, much more severe and much more volatile, which is precisely why we're seeing these protests. So that's, I think, one of the big takeaways here that strike me from Claudia's very astute presentation.
Thank you. Would either of you like to touch on how Western media has influenced or played a role in the protest? Has it helped? What can be done differently by our media to help the Iranian protests and to empower the voices of Iranians?
Claudia, why don't you go and I'll follow you.
Well, I was disappointed. Clearly we were trying to raise awareness in whatever way we could at the beginning, but we are in mid-week 3, and I mean, after 17 days, our president made a statement. So that's a long time, I think. But also the media, they didn't pick up during the first week. The second week, I noticed that, they're picking it up, but it's like a 1-minute thing at the end of each anchor. And it doesn't even go into the nuances and complexities of what is happening. And then gradually, I think it was last Sunday, I noticed that we had like a 5-minute, someone interview, but also the interviews or the media questions that I get, they email me and ask questions, for example, they're so essentialized and so reductive that some of them I ignore. I don't even respond because I don't know where to begin educating them. And many of the media anchors go to the same people and talk to the same people who are also, which is also another problem of, these same people are dominating the narrative, which is sometimes not the majority, the majority perspective. So that's what I think. But today, at least, I'm seeing that a few of people who I believe that, don't have any sort of ulterior motive or agenda are being interviewed, and the news media is at least, inviting them. That I'm a little bit hopeful, but we can do better.
Yeah, I'm a bit less critical than Claudia about the media. I've been following the New York Times coverage. There's a really good piece in today's New York Times by Nilu Tabrizi and someone else that looks at the videos that have come out of Iran to tell us, and then ask the question, what can we learn from watching these videos? And it's actually a really good analytical piece that talks about the diversity, the class composition of these protests. So the New York Times coverage, I think, has been fairly good. The BBC coverage, which I see a little bit, is not bad. Of course, you know, we would all like to see this, people who are following this story, we'd like to this story get a lot more attention. But of course, Iran, unfortunately, only matters for the West when there is, you know, when it overlaps with Western security interests. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that there's obviously understandable and supportive reporting of what's happening in Iran, largely because Western interests would love to see a regime change in Iran, not because there's a deep commitment to human rights and to women's equality, but because an uprising in Iran would be a dream come true for many Western policymakers, because Iran is viewed as a troublemaker in the region with a lot of justifiable reasons. So I ask myself, or ask my students, and we saw this a little bit during the Arab Spring about 10 years ago, that when protests break out in a pro-Western, you know, authoritarian regime, I suspect the coverage, as we saw roughly 10 years ago, would be less sympathetic. There is an underlying political culture here that shapes these debates. But that aside, I think, you know, I follow the Guardian coverage actually quite closely. Emma Garrison Harris, I believe her name is, has been covering this story really well. And so the Guardian coverage of what's happening, they had a good report right now about the singer Shervin Hajipour, who was arrested and then recently released. A good coverage of his particular plight. So it's been not bad, you know, it's been not bad. Christian Amanpour today had a very good interview with Fatima Shams, who is an Iranian studies scholar at University of Pennsylvania, who gave an insightful interview of what's happening and what's unique about these protests. So there's always room to criticize. I would say that, you know, people who've been involved in Middle East studies, Islamic studies for a long time, I would say that the media coverage today is drastically and significantly better than it was when I was beginning my career as an undergraduate student. Now you have people who actually have studied the region, have gone to school. Some of them, many of them speak the languages. They spend time in the region. You know, back in the 1980s, when I sort of started out, it was a very different picture, and it was very sort of the media portrayal of issues, specifically as they relate to the Middle East and specifically as they relate to religious themes, was very biased and one-sided. Now I think it's a bit more nuanced, and that's to be welcome. Still with room for improvement, but I think, you know, we're in a much better place today than we were, you know, 30, 40 years ago.
Or I would say even 3 weeks ago or 2 weeks ago, Dr. Hashemi, actually that interview with Dr. Shams, who was our panelist yesterday at our university, was something that gave me hope. We need to see more of that kind of interview. But I was so disappointed that there was no coverage over the weekend about the 150 cities who came out in solidarity with Iranian women across the world.
Yeah, that's a good point. There was almost very little coverage of those global protests, and you're going to have to ask the editors of the major news organizations why they didn't cover that, because they were major protests. Like in Toronto, where I'm from, 50,000 people turned out. That's huge, and they were sort of concurrent protests in different cities around the world. So yeah, I would agree with you on that point.
In talking about the coverage, do you think social media has impacted the movement or made the impact a little bit larger in Iran and the United States media?
Claudia, why don't you go?
I mean, absolutely, because on social media, especially Twitter, has been very influential with hashtags and everything, raising awareness. You know, we all have followers who come from all different cultures. So when they're following us and they're seeing that we are sharing everything constantly, so they get the exposure. I do think, you know, social media, at least the Iranian diaspora and the Iranians inside the country, as much as they have been able to with all the surveillance and, you know, the shutdowns of the internet, have been good. And I mean, we have been tagging CNN, BBC, everyone, all the anchors to make them, you know, pay attention.
Yeah, social media is very important. In fact, we know what's happening in Iran today because of the social media posts that come out. Now, of course, unsurprisingly, they've tried to slow down the internet. They've tried to block a lot of these messaging apps to prevent the word from getting up. But we're really reliant on social media because the Islamic Republic of Iran, like other authoritarian regimes around the world, don't allow independent media to go and report from what's happening. So these images that come out are a primary source of information. I think they still have to be interpreted, and scrutinized. But generally speaking, this is how we know what's going on in Iran because of social media. Just imagine if this was happening in the era before social media. It would be a complete blackout. We wouldn't know what's happening. And of course, the other good thing about social media, look, there's a lot of things wrong with social media, as we know from American democracy, how it can feed into these neo-fascist and authoritarian tendencies. But with respect to countries in the Middle East, social media also has a mutual reinforcing effect in terms of inspiring people and bringing people together and allowing people to connect and raise awareness. I mean, interesting, if you actually go back and look at the origins of the term Twitter revolution, it began with the Green Movement in 2009 and then quickly with the Arab Spring. So it was because of social media that helped get the word out and help people connect and mobilize and organize to go around the restrictions of these authoritarian regimes who want people depoliticized and don't want information to get out. So in that sense, social media is playing, I think, a very important constructive role in supporting emancipatory struggles in different parts of the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. And social media doesn't have that kind of bureaucracy, doesn't have any sort of leadership, power relations. So in a matter of minutes or even seconds, you can find your circle, like-minded people across the world. So this is one of the differences. I think one of the questions on the Q&A I'm seeing is about the parallels or differences between 2009 and now. Is, as Dr. Hashemi mentioned, the social media, but today social media is even more active and stronger. So we see more of the things that are happening in Iran. Back in 2009, the surveillance was stronger and the social media was not as active. I don't know if I personally was not active on Twitter back then, for example. So today, one of the differences today is that social media has a more instrumental, impact. But the parallel is that the globalization impact that the local and the global have come together at this point. It's generally called the global impact of digitization and digital media.
Yeah.
I want to bring in some other questions from our viewers. Someone also asked, to what extent are the protests against the compulsory hijab also a protest against Iran as an Islamic republic and even against Islam itself? And some, if you want to also talk about that later part, you're open to.
Do you want to take the lead, Dr. Hashemi?
Sure. I think overwhelmingly the protests are against authoritarianism, and because the Islamic Republic is an authoritarian regime and increasingly a brutal authoritarian regime, that's what people are protesting. I think there is a segment of the population, I think they mostly reside abroad, but I think within Iran, who have hostile and understandably hostile views toward religion per se. I mean, I can see it in my own family as a result of the policies of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and as a result of forced, politicized religion on people. Understandably, this produces a reaction where people then become just hostile to the very idea of religion itself. But having said that, so that is a current of opinion that exists in Iran. I think it's much greater than it ever has been in the last 43 years. But nonetheless, Iran is still a religious society, particularly as you move out of the urban centers, and you still have people, even if people who are burning their hijabs, they have relatives in their family who wear the hijab, or at least the previous generation. So, I think we always have to make distinctions. To talk about Iran as a monolithic whole is as inaccurate. It's just inaccurate analytical framework. One has to always make distinctions, and so I think the majority view, I mean, I'm speculating here, is against the compulsion of a particular form of dress and the compulsion of a particular view of Islam that is being imposed on people. I think if there is ever an opportunity, and I hope this will be a possibility in the coming months and years where Iranians are allowed to sort of determine their own future, you would see people, I think, graduating towards a view of religion where people can be as religious or irreligious as they like. It's just not the job of the state to impose that on people's, lives. And that's the core problem here. And so that's how I would read the question. It's a good question. And so that's how I would answer it.
Yeah, and we've seen a lot of, women in power who are actually religious and who are wearing the veil as part of their belief coming out in solidarity with this, population who's protesting in the on the streets. Even though they are not taking off their veils, but they believe in choice, and they believe in, the compulsory veil, to the abolishment of the compulsory nature of the veil.
Yeah.
So we have seen that solidarity over the past 3 weeks.
Yeah, I think that's very important, that type of solidarity. There's also a global point here that if you can't be supportive of the revolution that's underway in Iran today, and the desire for women to choose, what they want to wear. You can't be supportive of that social protest movement and not be supportive of the desire of Muslim women in other parts of the world, including in Western societies. And I'm thinking of France today and in the province of Quebec, who are also subject to state law and regulation over what they can and cannot wear. These are identical ethical sort of problems here that I think one has to respond to them with universal moral and intellectual consistency. So I think, if you support what's happening in Iran today, then you also have to support the right of women in France, Muslim women in France or in Quebec or in other parts of the world who don't have the same freedom of choice that we're demanding that the Iranian women be exposed to as well. So that's, I think, an important point to raise in this context.
Mm-hmm. The question, as Dr. Hashemi also mentioned, comes back to, nation states trying to map out their policies on, citizens' bodies, in this case, women's bodies, using basically the veil or dress code, any kind of dress code.
Yeah. Okay, I think I have another question. How essential is the mandatory veil for the ruling clergy? There were some of them who hinted on the possibility of a softer approach to the issue. Does this mean that Khomeini could step back in theory without losing the identity for which, as the speakers mentioned, the veil is an important component?
Yeah, that's a great question. If Claudia doesn't mind, I'd like to take a stab at it. Unfortunately for the ruling elite in Iran, the issue of the veil, the hijab, how women behave in public is a core aspect of their identity. And this is one of the big tragedies of this interpretation of Islam, because for this group of people, and of course there's parallels in the Arab world as well, the only thing about Islam that matters is regulating how women dress. And so, the backstory here is that modern Muslim political identity is shaped in relationship to the West. Whatever the West seems to be doing, modern Muslim political identity has been constructed in the opposite direction. So because there's a perception among these people in Iran and other parts of the Muslim world that Western women dress loosely or provocatively, when modern Muslim political identity was constructed, it was constructed in the opposite direction. So for the ruling elite in Iran, for Iran's supreme leader, the issue of women's clothing and dress is a core identity issue. I cannot see the regime ideologically or theologically backing away from that position because it's so deeply ingrained. I would argue it's part of their DNA. What I can see happening is, because there's a question now of political order and political control, that the regime taking a step back from the strict enforcement of it, because now things are slipping out of control, slipping out of the hands of the regime. If you look at the whole history of the Islamic Republic, they have an ideological agenda, but whenever the rubber hits the road, so to speak, whenever there's a major crisis, when the ideological agenda or preferences of the regime start to create regime instability or problems, the regime will backtrack and will make compromises, because this is a regime that fundamentally wants to survive. And there's many examples that I could cite, but I think we're facing this similar moment. So what I predict will happen was that the regime will, for the sake of its own survival, and we're seeing this right now, the morality police largely have been withdrawn from the streets. They're not enforcing it. They've all been, the regime will momentarily take a step back and not try and enforce this, because they know doing so creates exactly what we're seeing on the streets of Iran right now. But there'll never be a theological compromise. The only way that compromise will happen is when, possibly in the future, there is a democratic transition and there's no ability for people who have this strong belief in regulating women's lives and women's dress in the name of Islam, when they no longer have political power where they can enforce this on women. Then perhaps there'll be a shift, but not as long as the current structure of power remains in Iran. It's so deeply rooted in the ideology of the ruling elite. And by the way, the parallel here with the Arab world is basically, Salafi Islam. The Salafists in the Arab and Islamic world have an identical view about the role of women and the proper regulation of it. It's a direct parallel. Because of those reasons, because it's such a core aspect of this group of political actors' identity, I don't see any ideological compromise in that area. Perhaps in the enforcement, but not in the actual certainty of this position.
And if I may add, that's an identity that the Islamic Republic actually created right after, and it's not just by the dress code or the veil. It is by all the policies that they implemented, including the segregation of the public spaces, the gender segregation in public spaces, and the changes that they brought to the family protection law after 67 years of women's rights activists working on, earning some of those rights. They just went backwards. And then in terms of enforcing this, as Dr. Hashemi mentioned, it's like safety valve. I've lived through different presidencies in Iran, and you would see that whenever there were protests and there is some sort of resistance, the government will just step back and loosen things because of, as a safety valve, that safety net or something, that they are worried that things will happen, and then there will be crackdown later, a couple months later. So it's just so many ups and downs with this regime that you cannot even trust what's going to happen.
We only have about 12 minutes left, so I wanted to also touch on the role that United States policy has played towards Iran in the further isolation of the Iranian people. For example, the sanctions that were employed. So, or any of the critical historical and current geopolitical issues related to Iran from both U.S. perspective and from Iran or Iranians' perspectives.
Well, that's not my expertise. I think Dr. Hashemi has expertise in that. I will just tell you this is an opinion based as an individual, citizen, diaspora citizen of, or dual national of Iran, whatever, is that, the sanctions have not helped the people. So what are the sanctions useful for? The people right now in Iran are poor. Like it just brings poverty. If they don't have like the economic, corruption and the collapse of economy, and if they don't have food on their tables, and if they can't leave, what are the sanctions for? The sanctions should not be on people. The sanctions can be just like Justin Trudeau did, yesterday, announced sanctioning individual elite members of, affiliated members with the regime. That's a different story. But this is just an opinion.
I would agree with that. I would just sharpen the point a little bit. U.S. policy toward Iran has never been concerned with democracy and human rights. I mean, how could it be? Because if you know anything about the modern history of Iran, U.S. intervention in Iran, takes a very dramatic turn in 1953 when the United States overthrows democracy in Iran, or the potential of democracy in Iran. So there was no interest in democracy, promoting democracy or human rights in Iran prior to 79. And after 1979, the same story exists. I mean, human rights and democracy are always convenient instruments to use when you want to score ideological points. But in this entire debate on Iran's nuclear program, the question of human rights and democracy and how Iranians would be affected by draconian sanctions, both under Obama and then under Trump, was nowhere part of the political or foreign policy debate. And as Claudia rightly mentioned, these sanctions that have been imposed on Iran due to Trump's withdrawal of the nuclear agreement has had catastrophic effects on the average citizen, on the middle class, which is the core of the democracy movement, in terms of just crushing them. People either now want to flee or they're just struggling to survive. It's very difficult to organize politically when you're starving under these conditions. And of course, the ruling elite in Iran have not been affected to the same extent by the sanctions. In fact, I would argue that the effect, the practical political effect of the sanctions on Iran, crippling sanctions, have actually strengthened the ruling elite and pauperized the average person on the street. It's actually quite amazing that these protests have happened despite those economic sanctions. But I agree. I strongly favor targeted sanctions against people who have blood on their hands. But these broad-based sanctions, as we're seeing in Iran, as we saw in Iraq during the 1990s, and in other cases, often produce the opposite effect, undermining civil society and social protest movements and strengthening the ruling elites in the authoritarian regime as a consequence. So this is a big problem. And this is actually something that I think American Muslims have to be very sensitive to, because, as American Muslims, we are voters. We have a say in, at least theoretically, in the construction of American foreign policy. These are things that we could, change, elect candidates, vote candidates who understand these issues and can make a difference. Unfortunately, this is one of the big, I think, failings of American foreign policy with respect to Iran, is the complete focus on Iran's nuclear program, which is a problem. And an absence of any sort of serious attention on the internal situation in Iran with respect to democracy, human rights, civil society, etc.
All right. We probably have room for one more question, and then I can pass it to Slam for closing remarks. So how do you think, Dr. Claudia, you're talking about as a diaspora, how do you think the Iranian protests affect the lives of Iranian diaspora or Muslim diaspora, particularly those who identify as Iranian and or Shia Americans, and the perceptions of Muslim population worldwide due to the protests?
I mean, in terms of the Iranian diaspora, I don't know about the specific religious affiliations of them, but I can see in my circles that everybody mobilized immediately. And some were more cautious, because whenever there is questions about, the hijab, some of us are, it's a sensitive topic, obviously, so we are being very careful. But gradually, of course, all Iranians were mobilized. In terms of the larger diaspora, I have seen, Arab feminists, Afghan feminists coming out in solidarity, which has been very hopeful. But I've also seen the other side, which is silence. And it is amazing because, again, with questions of veiling, people are being very, very cautious. And that's why at the beginning, I was trying to, historicize and contextualize the veil in history of Iran, which is very different. And people miss the nuances and complexities, and that I think part of the reason for that silence is that lack of deep knowledge about everything in Iran.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, Iranian Americans are very are following what's happening very closely. There's been actually an incredible moment of unity here among the Iranian expat community. I think for American Muslims watching what's happening, I think there is a bit more nuance and perhaps even some confusion, because the general view that non-Iranians have, people who are Muslim or come from the region and they're not Iranian, they sort of view Iran through the prism of US foreign policy and the prism of the legacy of colonialism and imperialism. And they sort of have, many of them have sort of somewhat an innate sympathy that like Iran is sort of standing up to imperial aggression in the same way that Cuba has done so, and that's understandable. But you can't ignore the internal repression of an authoritarian regime, which is really the core story here. And of course, one of the things that I just want to emphasize, I said this earlier, when you have authoritarian Islam in power instead of ethical Islam in power, you produce the type of negative things that we're seeing in Iran. Higher rates of atheism, people just hating religion generally, a large sort of upsurge in things that I never thought I would see in Iran. So one of the things that are happening in Iran because of forced religion is a lot of of high rates of alcoholism. People are just sort of given up on the official narrative of the regime, and a lot of people privately are sort of consuming alcohol to such degrees that a few years ago when I looked at the statistics in Tehran itself, 150 alcohol treatment centers had to be set up to deal with the problem of alcoholism, because people in these urban centers had sort of completely rejected the narrative of the regime, and they associate that with Islam writ large. So I think that the position for the American Muslim community that is non-Iranian needs to sort of look at what's happening in Iran, not exclusively through the prism of Western imperialism and US foreign policy. That is a problem. And that is something that cannot be ignored, but also look at the consequences of internal authoritarianism and its effects on society, particularly when that authoritarian regime justifies itself in the name of Islam. This is something that I think requires much greater debate among American Muslims. And there's a lot to learn from the Iranian case that also applies to other human rights struggles and pro-democracy struggles across the Islamic world.
I think before we leave, one thing I want to emphasize is also the importance of, Mahsa Amini's ethnic background, which is being lost in many of the narratives today as we're talking about, the protests and women's rights activism. We forget talking about Kurdish women's rights activists. And we forget about the fact that Zhina Amini's family intentionally, on purpose, decided to do a public funeral, and that they were told not to. And they did that. The fact that all this protests and the uprising began in Saqqez, in a Kurdish community, and then it is incited and mobilized the entire country. And also we forget about, Zahedan, which was, massacred on Friday. We forget about Sistan, Baluchistan. So we have to also, look at all the ethnic minorities coming together during this time. It's not just the gender, women, men, and, our trans and queer community coming together, but also all sectors of the country, from ethnic, religious backgrounds, different backgrounds to, to different gender backgrounds. So I do think that we often forget. Last week, I attended a webinar specifically on Kurdish feminism and this moment, and I learned a lot on that webinar. And today, a Kurdish women's rights activist has been assassinated in Iraq. And this is a domino effect. I don't think these are coincidence, these things that happen. So I do think that we need to also consider, her ethnic background as for this moment. Like instead of going with the mainstream narrative and normalizing the larger umbrella, I think we have to look at the nuances, and there are so many complexities.
Thank you both. Sam, I can pass on to you for closing remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Libna. Thank you, Dr. Claudia Yahubi and Dr. Nader Hashmi for the very important and informative historical overview of this problem and the analysis as we're trying to determine next steps from a policy perspective as well as religious and social perspective as we try to connect with the Iranian people and supporting them over any kind of authoritarianism, whether it is a secular or religious tyranny. And indeed, religious tyranny in many ways is worse than a secular tyranny because religious tyranny is using the cloak of God and religion where you cannot dissent. And so you become oppositional to religion, and that explains in part why people are developing this antipathy towards Islam. It's very understandable, as you said, Dr. Hashmi. I think that the three takeaways for us in our work as the Muslim Public Affairs Council and our partner organizations, number one, dealing with the problem of the criminalization of women in law, especially in Islamic law or so-called Islamic law. These fatwas, opinions that are made that are really intended to control the population, and by controlling half the population, you oppress them, so you maintain power. And that leads to a larger problem of what is this idea of an Islamic state? If an Islamic state is structured to impose religion on people, as opposed to be that vehicle for restoring human dignity and pursuing freedom, which is what, in theory, what Islamic movements or the Islamic principles are outlining, then this is not Islam. If this is not about human dignity and freedom, then you cannot call it Islam. You call it whatever you want. You can put any kind of mask on it. Call it Islamic Republic, Islamic State, Islamic Monarch, Islamic Kingdom, what have you, but you cannot call it Islam if it opposes these very important principles. The second takeaway is to determine where is this origin of morality police? Prayer is compulsory for every Muslim, but governments cannot compel Muslims to pray. There's no compulsion in matters of faith, as it says in Surah 2, verse 256. So the hijab, which is much less of an absolute, it is implicit in the Quran, it is not explicit, and many people take it up. It is their choice, and many people do not. It is their choice. Government is to allow people to choose, not to compel in any religious activity. So the morality police came from this idea that the Quran says the believers are those who enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong. Well, it is about pursuing virtue. It is not about implementing law. Right. And unfortunately, many political Islamic movements have taken up the business of imposing an ideology on the people, and taken on the business of making Muslims better in terms of religion, and they have failed miserably, obviously, because that is not what Islam is intended to be. And so this idea of a committee to enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong has created the morality police, which has been a miserable failure in all these political Islamic movements. And we should be out front saying, this is not Islam, this is an adulteration and bastardization of these important Quranic verses. So that is our takeaway as the Muslim Public Affairs Council. And we hope that we can at least provide some avenue for supporting the Iranian people and all people working for freedom. And also, as Dr. Hashmi and Dr. Yahubi said, to demand from the United States and other Western governments non-interference with the Iranian people. The sanctions, the call for war, all these things are not intended to help the Iranian people. They're intended to just support an ideology here in the West, a right-wing ideology, a geopolitical ideology, national security that is also distorted, whereas we should be supporting human security, and that is the security of the civilian population. So I thank you for bringing out these points for us so that it's clear for us to do the work moving on. And your intellectual capital has been immeasurable and invaluable for all of us. So thank you again for taking the time to educate us and providing this these steps moving forward for us.
Great. Thanks, Salam, and to MPAC, and keep up the good work.
Thank you, Dr. Hashmi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yahobi. We look forward to working with you further.
Thank you. Thanks for organizing.
Yeah, take care.
All right, have a good night. Bye.
Thank you.